Good morning.
Good morning.
So I have a phrase to toss out to you. Let's see if you agree. Our perception, the way that we experience others, people and situations, combined with our own life experience, affects how we respond to them. Would you agree with that? So who we are, what we've experienced in our lives, the things that we've been taught, the things that we think we know already, and our perception of how other people act and how they behave and how they are, combine to cause us to respond. Now, sometimes those responses are positive. When we meet somebody who is supportive and kind and friendly and what we perceive as good, then we might have a response of gratitude or a response of kindness. But we can also have negative responses to others, right? And sometimes those negative responses, our perception that people are not nice, or that they are aggressive, or that they have some ulterior motive, can cause us to respond in judgment, to respond with accusations, and to blame. Often, we form these perceptions before we even take a second to think about what we're about to think. Like we haven't thought it through. We are so quick to respond that we see something, we form an opinion, and before we can speak to it, we already have an idea of what we think and how we're going to act. And sometimes this works in our favor, especially if we were in danger. It would work to our favor. But sometimes when we're with our friends or we're with people that we know casually, it doesn't work to our favor. It actually ends up causing some division and some distance between us. In today's first reading from Genesis, there is a whole lot of blame going on, right? Kind of like a whole lot of shaking going on, but we got a whole lot of blame going on. Adam is blaming Eve. Eve's blaming the serpent. The serpent's kind of like, God's unhappy. God shows up and God's like, what the heck have you done? Why did you do it? Didn't I tell you not to do that? God shows up at that parent going, I told you not to. What the heck? What are you doing? And Adam's response is, you gave her to me and she did it. And then she turns around and goes, well, yeah, I ate, but it's his fault because, he's the one that took me there. And nobody will actually own up and take responsibility for what they've done. In our gospel today, we hear a whole lot of accusation going on. So, Jesus' family is there in Nazareth, and the crowds are walking around accusing Jesus of being out of his mind. And whether they respond in care for Jesus, like, hey, brother, you're going a bit too far, come on back in, or whether they're embarrassed because of how he's acting, or whether they're a little bit terrified too by what they've seen, we don't know. But what we do know is that right away they're trying to contain him and hold him in and put him back down to where they think he ought to be. But Jesus didn't come to be put down. Jesus came to disrupt. You remember that we've talked about how Jesus came to shake up the world, to bring this new way of being, to say to the people who had an already existing idea of what faith was, what the church was, what the temple was, and how it ought to be. And Jesus is like, there's something new here. There's something different. You're missing the mark over here. There's an invitation. But instead, the scribes show up, and what do they say? He's got the devil in him. He's casting out evil with evil. And of course, Jesus tells a parable. And he corrects them, and he makes a very clear, solid statement that they can't respond to, which is, you can't tear a house down with the house. House divided, a house against itself will split. And so he defends. But it's important that we kind of take a look at Mark. Because Mark, in typical Markan style, things happen urgently. Mark is about this moment, about the now, about right now. Now is the time. The kingdom is now. We got to respond now. We're in chapter 3, and in the first 3 chapters from Mark 1, 14, 15, where he is baptized by John, Jesus has already defeated the devil in the wilderness. He has already cooled a fever, healed a leper, paralyzed person is able to not be paralyzed, withering hand is healed. He's called 12 disciples, and he's completed a speaking tour. He's been a busy guy. And right now, here he is, and he's in this intense moment where everything that he has done that has shaken up the status quo has disrupted people and caused them to lash out in accusation. Because mostly, they don't understand. They don't get it. And if it doesn't make sense, then it's threatening. It's threatening to their power, it's threatening to their understanding, it is threatening to the world. And they just want it to stop so they feel better. They haven't even taken a moment to dialogue with him, to ask a question. Within uncomfortable moments like these, times when we are confronted, times when we feel out of control because things aren't going a way that we are familiar with or that we like, we have a propensity as human beings to name and to blame and to accuse. Brené Brown, some of you may have heard of her. Brené Brown is an author and she is a research scientist. And she tells this story about herself, about how instantaneously and quick she jumps to blame. And the story goes like this. She gets up one morning, she's dressed and ready for work. She goes down to the kitchen and she pours herself a nice cup of coffee. And then she turns around and she drops the cup and it goes to the ground and it splatters on the floor and it breaks into pieces and her white pants are completely soaked in brown coffee. And within a nanosecond she says, "Darn it, Steve!" Steve's her husband. And then she goes in her head to all the ways in which he's responsible. Because, he came home last night a little late, so I got to bed late, and I didn't have enough sleep, and so I wasn't rested, and then I really should have had coffee brought to me, but it didn't get brought to me, and now here I am, and my clothes are ruined, and it's all your fault. A few minutes later, the phone rings, and she picks it up, and it's him, and he says, "Hey, babe, how are you doing?" And she says, "Fine." And he's like, "Fine?" She said, "Yep." He said, "I'll talk to you later," and he hangs up. Because he's been with her long enough to know that this is what she does. She immediately goes through a loop, jumps to conclusions, and places blame and forgets to pause and check herself before she does it. The beautiful thing, though, is her work is around blame. And this is what she tells us her research has shown. Her research has shown that blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. So think about that. When you blame someone, it's simply you trying to get that pain and that discomfort off of you and onto somebody else. It's a very human thing to not want to be discomforted. But blame has an inverse relationship with accountability. Because accountability, by definition, is vulnerable. To take responsibility for our actions and our words and the things that we have done means we have to be vulnerable. Because to own our own stuff means, oh my gosh, it's me. I did it. And it feels uncomfortable. Like Adam, who blamed Eve. Like Eve, who blamed the serpent. Like the scribes blaming Jesus. Blame automatically pits us against one another. It does not forge relationship, it divides. And it automatically puts us in this defensive position where instead of having control over ourselves and our own choices and taking ownership of that, we end up pushing back. Accountability for Brené is calling up and saying to you, "Hey, what you said to me yesterday really hurt my feelings, and I'd like to talk about it." It means being able to say, let's dialogue, let me express to you how I'm feeling, what my experience was, and then let me listen to you. And let's try to make this happen in relationship. It is not about blaming. We are to express our care for one another. And so think about it. The serpent suggested that Eve take a bite of the fruit. And he kind of told her all the cool things that would come about if she did. And she is a human being. And she thought, that'd be kind of cool. I'd like to be like God. I'd like to have all that beauty. I think that would be awesome. And she can imagine life as a wise, powerful person. I think we all can. So she ate, and then she went to her buddy and said, hey, you want some too? And he thought, So he ate. And here's the thing, neither of them were coerced. Neither of them were forced to put the food in their mouth. All of them could see something beyond that moment that they maybe wanted. And they forgot about that other thing, that promise, that accountability. So, this is what we know. We know that God wasn't happy because all of these actions shifted God's world. God created them, and they're in this beautiful place, and God wants to have them kind of hang out and be his people forever. And if we read further in Genesis, we learn that God didn't want them to have any of that wisdom and knowledge. You remember hearing in the Old Testament about God being a jealous God. Doesn't want any others around. Well, heaven forbid human beings rise up to a level of God that God's got to compete with. Right? And he maybe even knew, maybe, and I say he, but God knew that human beings would probably mess it up. Because that's part of our DNA, is that we are fallible. We are people who make choices sometimes that aren't so great. Here is the thing, though. A couple things to note. When we pause long enough, when we hit that pause button before we react, before we go seeking the thing or the person that's to blame, before we respond, as Renee says, hey, so when something goes wrong, what's your response? Whose fault is it? Before we go to that, we get the invitation to own our part in the situation and take a stand with our shoes in integrity. We get a chance to take ourselves out of a powerless situation and to claim our own power by honoring who we are before we start to figure out what happened. The second is that out of sharing what happens with one another, out of coming to you and saying, my experience of this was this, and I found it really difficult and I don't know what to do about it, but I want to talk to you. By doing that, we create a space for empathy. Empathy. Now, can you imagine, what if the story of Adam and Eve was different? What if Eve was not an antagonist, as many will tell us she is, but instead a protagonist? What if, in fact, Eve did exactly what God called her to do, which is to take she and Adam from being passive creatures of God who just use and receive all God's goodness and transform them into active people who are out in the world doing God's work in the world? What if, because they actually pushed the envelope and did something they shouldn't have, there's a transformation that awaits us? Because there are commentators, there are people that will tell you that Eve is responsible for the downfall of the world. They will tell you that one woman who didn't do what she was supposed to do and ate a piece of fruit is the reason the whole world is screwed up. Because it possibly cannot be us. It can't be me, it can't be you, it can't be any of us on any given day. We get to point the finger biblically to her and say, you're the one that did it. And then you did it to him. And all that comes out of that is wrong. All of the story that has been perpetuated for thousands of years that blames one or two people for the demise of the world is not fair. because it takes us out of our accountability seat and it makes us not take ownership of what we're doing because we get to just point that finger. So the invitation is to step into the integrity and the accountability as best we can. So how do we do that? We can do that by rethinking, by rewriting the story, and by mindfulness. Author Alice Updike Scannell writes in a book called Building Resilience about mindfulness. And she says this: mindfulness is a skill which enables us to clear away our inclination to respond habitually or to respond reactively when we're confronted by a troublesome situation. Mindfulness, she says, brings us into this moment, the present moment, and it creates a mental and emotional space for us to shift ourselves, to change our course, and to move from being reactive and defensive to becoming people who have a posture of awareness and who can take responsibility for themselves first and then for others. So there's this invitation for us today. The invitation is to pause. The next time that somebody pushes your button, the next time that things fall apart, the next time you drop a cup of coffee and it splatters all over and breaks on the kitchen floor and you gotta clean it up, to take a second, to take a deep breath in, and to call upon God and say, okay, God, and then breathe out, help me figure it out. To be mindful, to not act out, to not blame, to not be in a nasty mood that we just throw upon everybody else we encounter that day because that one thing didn't go well. But to call upon God and to breathe deeply and to be mindful enough that we can begin to see the truth of our situations, and then we can allow ourselves to act accordingly. It doesn't mean that the bad things happen aren't worth our anger. It doesn't mean that the horrible things that we encounter or the nasty person that pushes up against us doesn't need to be pushed back, because none of us deserve bad things to happen and or nasty people in our lives. But it does call upon us to take that next higher road, the road that Jesus would take, which is, I'm going to tell you a story and I'm going to share with you why this matters. I'm going to invite you to be my family. I'm going to have you come along and make a difference in the world with me. But to do that, no more naming, no more blaming, no more accusations, only love. Amen.